I never thought I would be the kind of person telling my story to strangers, but life has a way of pushing you into places you never planned to stand. I'm sharing this now not because everything is resolved, but because I finally understand something I didn't back then. Waiting silently can break a person in ways no one sees coming. My name is Amara Reynolds, and 9 years ago, I married a man I believed would change my life forever. When I met Marcus Hale, he was already living in Atlanta, Georgia, working as a software consultant. He was calm, confident, and spoke about the future with certainty. I was living in Oakville, Ontario, close to my family, working, helping out at home, and doing what many women are taught to do, waiting for the right moment, the right partner, the right life. When Marcus came into my world, everything felt aligned. He talked about partnership, stability, and building a home together. Not just emotionally, but physically, under the same roof. Our wedding was beautiful. That's the word everyone uses, and for once, it truly fits. The hall was full, laughter everywhere, cameras flashing. People hugged me and said things like, "You're so lucky," and "Your future is secure now." I believed them. I believed that chapter of my life had officially closed and a new one had begun. But exactly 1 month after our wedding, Marcus packed his bags and returned to the United States. I remember standing at the airport that day, holding on to hope like it was something solid. Before he left, he held my hands and promised me something I replayed in my head for years. He said he would immediately start processing my immigration papers. He said the separation was temporary. He said I'd be with him soon. I didn't question him, not once. Why would I? He was my husband. The first year wasn't easy, but I told myself it was normal. Every long-distance couple goes through a phase like this, right? Whenever I asked about my visa, Marcus always had an answer. Sometimes it was paperwork delays. Sometimes it was immigration backlogs. Once, he said there wasn't enough proof of strong family ties in the US. The explanation sounded official, complicated, above my understanding. So I trusted him. Then a year passed. And nothing changed. Marcus came home during holidays, usually every 2 years. When he did, life felt briefly complete. During one of those visits, I became pregnant. I told myself it was a sign. A sign that the distance would soon end. But after the baby came, Marcus left again. And then it happened again. And again. By the time I had my 3rd child, I had spent most of my marriage physically alone. From the outside, no one would have guessed anything was wrong. Marcus provided financially. He built a comfortable, modern apartment for me and the children. He opened a large boutique business in my name. I had help. I had resources. I had everything people assume equals happiness. But loneliness doesn't disappear just because bills are paid. I raised 3 children largely on my own. I attended school meetings alone. I handled sick nights alone. I made decisions alone. There were moments I wanted to share with my husband, small victories, overwhelming days. But all I had was a phone call across borders and time zones. I was married, yet living like a single parent. I didn't complain much. In my family, patience was praised. Strength was measured by how much you could endure quietly. I told myself this was the price of love. That waiting was part of the journey. Everything shifted during Marcus's visit when our youngest child turned 2. That visit felt different. He expected things to continue the way they always had. But something in me had changed. When he tried to initiate intimacy, I stopped him. Not angrily. Not dramatically. Just firmly. I told him I couldn't continue like this. I told him I was tired of being alone. I told him I wouldn't bring another child into a life where I felt emotionally abandoned. I said something I had never said before. If my visa isn't ready, I'm not getting pregnant again. That sentence shook everything. Marcus was upset. His family was furious. Meetings were called. Elders spoke. Accusations flew around the room like knives. I was told I was being ungrateful. I was reminded of everything Marcus had done for me financially. Some people made it sound like marriage was a debt I owed, not a partnership I deserved. But for the first time in 9 years, I didn't give in. And then, something happened that still doesn't sit right with me. Exactly 1 month later, I received a call. My visa was approved. Not just mine, but all 3 of my children's too. After nearly a decade of delays, excuses, and waiting, everything moved at once. At the time, I thought it was a miracle. I had no idea what was waiting for me next. When the call came, I didn't answer it at first. I remember staring at my phone, watching it vibrate against the kitchen counter, my heart pounding so loudly I could hear it in my ears. Something about that moment felt unreal, like my body already knew the news before my mind was ready to receive it. When I finally picked up, the woman on the other end spoke calmly, professionally. Her voice carried no drama, just facts. My visa had been approved. My children's visas had been approved too. For a few seconds, I couldn't speak. I sat down slowly, afraid my legs would give out. After 9 years of waiting, explanations, and disappointment, the thing I had almost stopped believing in had finally happened. I thanked the woman, hung up, and then did something I hadn't done in a long time. I cried without holding myself together. I called my brother first. Then my parents. Then Marcus. Everyone reacted the same way: shock, excitement, disbelief. People kept saying, "God has finally answered your prayers," and "your patience has paid off." I wanted to believe that. I truly did. But somewhere deep inside me, a small, quiet voice whispered that everything had happened too fast. I ignored that voice. The days that followed were filled with celebration. My family organized a gathering at our home in Oakville. Relatives traveled in from nearby cities. Friends brought food, gifts, and advice about life abroad. People laughed, ate, drank, and spoke about America like it was a promised land. I smiled so much my face hurt. For the first time in years, I felt seen, not as a woman waiting, but as a woman finally moving forward. At night, when everyone left and the house grew quiet, I lay awake imagining my new life. I pictured waking up next to my husband every morning. I imagined my children calling out to both parents at once. I imagined grocery shopping together, attending school events as a family, living like a unit instead of fragments spread across continents. I told myself the waiting was over. That the hardest part was behind me. Marcus sounded happy when we spoke, but something about his tone had changed. He was less detailed, more reserved. When I asked practical questions, about schools, neighborhoods, daily routines, he often said, "We'll figure it out when you arrive." I assumed he was busy. I didn't push. Looking back now, I realize I should have. As the travel date approached, everything became intense. Documents needed organizing. Bags needed packing. Children needed reassurance. Everyone wanted my attention at once. I barely slept. My body moved, but my mind felt like it was always racing ahead, trying to prepare for a life I had waited nearly a decade to enter. The night before our flight, I felt a strange heaviness in my chest. Not fear exactly, something deeper. I told myself it was normal. Anyone would feel overwhelmed after such a long wait. I prayed, packed, and forced myself to rest. The next morning, my brother Daniel, 2 of my cousins, and my aunt escorted us to Toronto Pearson International Airport. The kids were excited, running ahead, dragging their small suitcases behind them. I watched them and felt a rush of emotion so strong it almost knocked the breath out of me. This was it. The end of one life. The beginning of another. At the airport, everything felt louder and brighter than usual. Announcements echoed. Wheels rolled across the floor. People rushed past us with purpose. As we waited in line, I suddenly felt disconnected from my surroundings, like I was underwater watching the world move above me. My brother asked if I was okay. I nodded. But I wasn't. My thoughts began to scatter. Simple sentences felt hard to form. My heart started racing for no clear reason. I remember gripping my handbag tightly, afraid that if I let go of something solid, I would float away. The children were talking, but their voices sounded distant, muffled. Then I noticed my brother's face. He looked worried. I tried to tell him I felt strange, but the words came out wrong. My tongue felt heavy. My chest tightened. I remember thinking, I can't do this. Something is wrong. And then, everything blurred. I didn't faint the way people expect. I didn't fall dramatically. I just slipped. My awareness fractured. I was aware enough to know people were speaking to me, but not enough to respond properly. I saw fear on my family's faces, and that terrified me more than anything else. Medical staff were called. I remember bright lights. Questions I couldn't answer clearly. My children crying. My brother holding my hand, telling me to breathe. I never boarded that flight. They took us back home. In the days that followed, doctors used words like acute stress reaction, emotional overload, and psychological collapse. They said it wasn't sudden, that it was the result of years of suppressed stress finally demanding attention. They told my family I hadn't broken in one moment. I had been breaking slowly for a long time. 3 months have passed since that day. I am better than I was, but not the same. Marcus is expected to arrive soon. There are conversations we need to have, conversations that can no longer be avoided. Questions that have been waiting 9 years for answers. And there is something else, something I haven't shared yet. Something I only realized after everything fell apart. Because the truth is, the visa delay may not have been the real problem at all. And when I finally understood why my body refused to board that plane, everything I believed about my marriage began to change. They say the body remembers what the mind tries to survive. For weeks after the airport, I replayed that day over and over in my head, searching for the exact moment everything went wrong. I wanted a clear explanation, something neat and medical, something I could point to and say, this is why. But healing doesn't always come with clarity. Sometimes it comes with questions that refuse to stay quiet. The doctors told my family that what happened to me wasn't random. One psychiatrist explained it in a way that finally made sense. Your system hit a limit. She said I had spent nearly a decade in a state of emotional suspension, never settled, never reunited, never fully abandoned either. My life had been a long hallway with no doors, just waiting. And when the exit finally appeared, my body panicked. At first, I didn't want to accept that explanation. It felt too simple for something that had shattered my life so completely. But as the days passed, memories began resurfacing, things I had brushed aside, minimized, or normalized because that's what I had been trained to do. I started remembering conversations with Marcus that never quite sat right. Like the times I asked him for updates about my papers and he would change the subject. Or the way he discouraged me from speaking directly with an immigration lawyer, insisting he had everything under control. Or how he always seemed calm about the delays, almost too calm for someone who claimed to miss his family desperately. Then there were the holidays. He never extended his stays. Never suggested I visit him temporarily. Never talked seriously about timelines, just vague reassurances. Soon. Be patient. Trust me. I had trusted him so deeply that I never noticed how one-sided that trust had become. During therapy sessions, my counselor asked a question that stopped me cold. She said, Amara, if nothing had gone wrong at the airport, what part of going to the US scared you? At first, I said nothing. I didn't want to sound ungrateful. But the truth rose up anyway. I was afraid of arriving somewhere I wasn't actually wanted. That realization shook me. Because the more I thought about it, the more I realized how little space Marcus had made for me in his life abroad. I didn't know his friends well. I didn't know his daily routine. I didn't even know where we would live long term. Everything had been postponed until my arrival, as if my presence was something he hadn't fully prepared for. I began to wonder if my body collapsed at the airport not because it was weak, but because it was protecting me. That thought terrified me. As I recovered slowly at home, my brother became my anchor. Daniel didn't rush me. He listened. One night, while the children were asleep, he asked me gently if I believed Marcus had told me everything. I wanted to say yes. I needed to say yes. But the word wouldn't come out. Instead, I cried. A few days later, a relative mentioned something casually, almost accidentally. She had seen Marcus tagged in a photo online months earlier. A photo taken in Atlanta. At a family barbecue. With a woman standing close beside him. Too close to ignore. I told myself not to jump to conclusions. Photos lie. Context matters. But once the thought entered my mind, it refused to leave. I asked Marcus about it during a video call. His reaction wasn't anger. It wasn't denial either. It was silence. That silence stretched long enough to say everything. He eventually told me the woman was just a friend. That I was overthinking. But his explanations felt hurried, defensive. And suddenly, the visa delays, the emotional distance, the lack of urgency, they all rearranged themselves into a picture I didn't want to see. I realized then that my breakdown hadn't started at the airport. It had started years earlier, every time I swallowed disappointment. Every time I told myself my needs were too much. Every time I accepted silence as love. The doctors adjusted my treatment. Therapy continued. Slowly, my thoughts began to organize themselves again. I wasn't lost. I was exhausted. Deeply. Dangerously exhausted. And now Marcus was coming. The idea of seeing him again filled me with conflicting emotions, relief, fear, anger, and a strange sense of clarity. Because for the first time, I wasn't waiting to be chosen. I was waiting to ask questions. Real ones. There were things I needed to know. About the delays. About his life in Atlanta. About whether I was meant to join him, or simply remain a convenient distance away. I no longer knew what the outcome would be. But I knew this. Whatever happened next would not be built on silence. Because the truth has a way of demanding space. And my body had already paid the price for ignoring it. The day Marcus arrived, the house felt too quiet. I had imagined this moment so many times over the years, reunions at airports, long embraces, tears of relief. But now that the moment was actually here, my body reacted differently. I wasn't excited. I wasn't angry either. I felt alert, like someone preparing to hear a truth they couldn't unhear. My brother Daniel drove to pick him up from the airport. I stayed home with the children. Part of me wanted to see Marcus walk through the door after all this time, but another part of me needed space, time to steady myself, to remember that I was no longer the woman who waited quietly. When Marcus finally stepped inside the house, he looked older. Tired. His confidence, once so effortless, seemed muted. He hugged the children first, holding them tightly, whispering apologies that sounded sincere. When his eyes met mine, he smiled, but it faltered. "You look better," he said. That comment stayed with me. Better suggested I had been broken. Suggested something had gone wrong inside me, rather than around me. We didn't argue that first day. We spoke politely, cautiously, like two people who knew one wrong word could open a floodgate neither of us was ready for. That night, after the children were asleep, I asked him to sit with me in the living room. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't accuse him. I simply told him I needed honesty, complete honesty, because my health depended on it. He sighed, leaned back, and stared at the ceiling for a long time before speaking. That was when the truth finally began to surface. Marcus admitted that the visa delays were not entirely due to immigration issues. Yes, paperwork had been involved, but not to the extent he had described. The real problem, he confessed, was that he had been afraid. Afraid of change. Afraid of responsibility. Afraid of collapsing the carefully managed life he had built in the U.S. He admitted that bringing me and the children to Atlanta would have meant restructuring everything: his finances, his living arrangements, his routines. He had convinced himself that delaying was better than deciding. That keeping things as they were was easier than committing fully to a shared life. I listened without interrupting, though every sentence landed like weight on my chest. Then he said something that finally explained the silence, the distance, the years of postponement. He told me he had been living two lives. Not in the dramatic way people imagine, but in a quiet, cowardly one. He had companionship in Atlanta. Someone who helped him feel less alone, less burdened. He insisted it wasn't what I was thinking. But by then, the details no longer mattered. What mattered was that I had been absent from his daily life, not because of borders, but because of choice. I felt strangely calm. Not because it didn't hurt, but because my body already knew. Everything I had been questioning suddenly aligned. The lack of urgency. The comfort with distance. The way my arrival always seemed like a future event rather than a present plan. I realized then that my breakdown at the airport wasn't a failure. It was a refusal. My mind had been catching up to what my body already understood. I told Marcus that I had spent 9 years shrinking myself to fit a waiting room he had no intention of closing. I told him that I had mistaken financial provision for emotional presence. And I told him that while I still cared about him, I could no longer ignore what my health had already paid for. He cried. He apologized. He said he didn't realize how deeply it had affected me. I believed he was sorry, but I also understood that regret does not undo harm. In the weeks that followed, we began therapy, separately and together. Not to rush toward reconciliation, but to understand what had been lost. The children adjusted slowly, sensing the shift even when no one spoke about it directly. I began rebuilding myself, not as someone waiting to be chosen, but as someone learning to choose herself. Some days are still hard. Healing isn't linear. But I no longer confuse silence with peace, or patience with love. I am learning that real partnership requires presence, not promises postponed indefinitely. And here is what I want people listening to my story to understand. If your body is screaming, don't silence it. If your spirit is exhausted, don't call it weakness. And if love requires you to disappear to survive, then it isn't love. My story doesn't end with a perfect resolution. Life rarely does. But it ends with clarity. And sometimes, clarity is the beginning of everything. There is a strange silence that comes after the truth finally settles. Not the loud kind, the kind where everything feels broken, but a quieter one, where your mind stops racing and your body slowly exhales for the first time in years. That silence came to me weeks after Marcus arrived, after the conversations, the tears, the apologies, and the therapy sessions. It came when I realized that nothing else needed to be uncovered. There were no more secrets hiding in the corners. Only choices. Marcus and I didn't rush into any decisions. For once, there was no urgency. No pressure to fix things quickly. We had both learned, too late, but honestly, that avoidance creates deeper wounds than conflict ever could. We agreed to live separately for a while, even while he remained in Canada to spend time with the children. That distance, ironically, felt healthier than the one we had lived with for 9 years. For the first time since my marriage began, I focused on my own recovery without guilt. Therapy became a place of rebuilding rather than repair. I learned that what happened to me at the airport wasn't weakness or embarrassment, it was burnout. Emotional burnout that had been accumulating silently, disguised as patience and endurance. I learned that the body keeps its own record of neglect, even when the mind is busy explaining it away. One of the hardest realizations was understanding how often society praises women for holding on, without asking what they're holding on to, or what it's costing them. I had been applauded for being strong, faithful, and patient. But no one asked how lonely I was. No one questioned why a marriage could survive on visits and promises alone. And for a long time, I didn't ask either. My children noticed the change before anyone else did. They saw me speak more openly, rest more intentionally, say no without apologizing. They began asking questions, not about conflict, but about honesty. About why families sometimes live apart. About why adults make choices that hurt people they love. I answered them carefully, truthfully, without placing blame. I wanted them to learn something I hadn't learned early enough: love requires presence, not just intention. Marcus, to his credit, stayed in therapy. He confronted parts of himself he had spent years avoiding: fear of responsibility, fear of disruption, fear of emotional exposure. Whether that work will lead us back together or permanently apart is something I still don't know. And for the first time, I'm okay with not knowing. What I do know is this: I am no longer waiting. I no longer measure my worth by how long I can endure discomfort. I no longer confuse provision with partnership. And I no longer believe that silence is proof of peace. The breakdown that once felt like the end of my life became the moment my life demanded honesty. If you're listening to my story and something in you feels unsettled, I want you to hear this clearly: your body is not betraying you. Your exhaustion is not imaginary. And needing clarity does not make you ungrateful or disloyal. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do, for yourself and everyone involved, is to stop surviving quietly and start asking real questions. I'm sharing this not because my story is unique, but because it's painfully common. Long-distance marriages. Deferred promises. Emotional labor disguised as strength. If any part of my experience sounds familiar, you are not alone, and you are not broken. So I'll end with this. If you've ever waited years for something that kept moving just out of reach. If you've ever been told to be patient while your life stayed on pause. If your body has ever forced you to stop when your mind refused to. Please share your thoughts. Your advice. Your experience. Because healing doesn't happen in isolation. And sometimes, telling the truth, out loud, is where it finally begins.